Welcome, Professor Scott Mainwaring, to this episode of Brazil Today. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. And the idea today is to talk about the current state of democracy in Brazil. What's going on in Brazil today? As you know, many analysts are worried about our democracy. So the idea is to discuss a little bit those dangers to Brazilian democracy. But before talking about today, I think you have to go back to at least 2014 when President Dilma Rousseff was reelected. And the opposition party, PSDB at the time, did not really accept the defeat. Aécio Neves, who was the defeating candidate, really did everything to undermine that second presidency. And we had 2 years later a very controversial impeachment by President Rousseff. So can you tell us about the context of Brazil in that time, 2014-16, and how do you see now that we're a little bit further out, how do you see that impeachment of 2016? Do you think that was proof that our political institutions were working, or do you see as maybe a soft coup that ousted the president?
Sure. Great questions. Maybe just a little background before even 2014. Going into 2014, Brazil had been through 2 pretty good decades, a lot of major achievements for Brazilian democracy. But in 2014, things really started to unravel. The economy started to tank. Most economists agree that the Workers' Party government mismanaged the economy. That was a very close election. It was the closest presidential election in Brazil's history, at least since redemocratization in 1985. The other big thing that was going on was these massive corruption scandals, which involved a lot of the Brazilian political class, many of its biggest business corporations. I think it's clear that the PT governments induced a lot of that corruption. This wasn't a new phenomenon in Brazil, and it led to intense polarization. So it's one of the big problems in democracy in the US, and it's a similar situation in Brazil, hyperpolarization. This hyperpolarization is a bit of the context for the PSDB's not complete acceptance of the election results in 2014. Brazilian democracy could pretty easily have gotten over that, but then the economy continued to tank. The news about corruption scandals became daily. This was, I think, without question, the biggest corruption scandal in world history of democracy. And this leads up to the 2016 impeachment of Dilma Rousseff. The impeachment had pretty wide public opinion support, a little bit north of 60%, but it was very questionable. The legal grounds for impeaching President Dilma were thin. It was budgetary manipulation. She was not herself charged with corruption. The defenders of the impeachment say that the PT government, with her as president, engaged in much greater budgetary manipulation than previous presidents, but previous presidents had done some of the same. So that the 2016 impeachment further polarized the country. And then you had the inauguration of Michel Temer as president. His presidency was a disaster. Dilma's public opinion approval ratings fell to 7%. Michel Temer's fell to 3%. I mean, if your dog and wife support you, you're almost at 3%, right? So that was, that really led to the discrediting of both sides of the Brazilian establishment. Both the conservative establishment and the left were deeply discredited at the time of the 2018 elections. I think it's a complex situation, but I think that's the essential backdrop for the election of Jair Bolsonaro in 2018.
Yeah, that is a perfect contextualization because that hyperpolarization explains the rise of a candidate who had been in politics for decades, but had been at the margins of the center of politics
Yes,
in Brazil.
Bolsonaro was a very marginal figure. He'd been elected 7 times as a federal deputy, so he had almost 28 years in the National Congress. But he was a very, very marginal figure until 2018.
And talking about democracy, he had during his career, during those decades, he had openly advocated for a return of military dictatorship. He had openly, showed disdain for the democratic institutions.
Absolutely. I mean, you could not imagine someone with a clearer anti-democratic discourse. Not only anti-democratic, but also his, very sexist discourse, homophobic discourse. He's quite remarkable.
Yeah, but still he was legitimately elected president, in an unequivocal election in 2018, and it's interesting because the same system that elected him, it's a system that has been undermining the credibility of the electronic voting system in Brazil, which is which has been our pride for many years. We have a very reliable, fast, efficient electronic voting system.
Yes.
So,
well, I agree with you that the election in 2018 was free and fair, but the Brazilian left does not agree with that. They argue that that Lula should have been able to campaign for president. And I don't know if Lula would have won. I think it would have been close. But they argue that the exclusion of Lula made that election unfair.
Yeah, that's a very important and good point. And now, as you know, Lula is eligible again to run for president, right? So this is an aspect that we discussed in episode 1. So probably we're going to have, a face-off between Lula and Bolsonaro. But all the polls show that it's very hard for Bolsonaro to win that election, right? He still has the support of his hardcore supporters. He has those votes. That's going to be enough to let him go to the runoff elections. But Lula is still that very strong political figure.
Yes, exactly. Lula is the overwhelming favorite at this time, without question.
Yeah, and on that point, Bolsonaro has been he has been discrediting the electronic voting system in Brazil. So my question is, do you think that there might be a repeat in Brazil of what happened in the United States when Trump lost the general elections recently? So do you see the same thing happen in Brazil, maybe even a repeat of the violent episodes you had here in the States?
I think there could be violence, but I have a hard time imagining a repeat of the same situation. Brazil has a very clean and clear set of electoral institutions. The U.S., there are many great things that one can say about U.S. democracy, but our electoral institutions are bizarre. They're, in many respects, antiquated. And the fact that, that states run the elections, states run federal elections. There is no federal, there's no authority at the federal level that dictates how states run federal elections in the U.S. There is a Federal Electoral Commission, but it has quite marginal influence over how votes are tabulated, what the rules are for eligibility. All of these things are run at the state level in the U.S. And as we saw in 2020 through January 6th, 2021, this leaves a great deal of margin for, let's call it, bizarre behavior, for questioning electoral results in the U.S. In Brazil, there's just not that kind of space. So I could imagine some of Bolsonaro's followers engaging in violence and not accepting a result. But first of all, I mean, at this time, we don't know. There's still 8 months until the election, but more than 8 months. But probably Lula will win convincingly. And a convincing win gives much less space for the opposition to claim that there was fraud. But in the second place, even if Bolsonaro loses and claims that he lost by fraud, I can't imagine Brazil's judiciary supporting that. There are no state assemblies that will help determine, who won the election. So I think it's very unlikely that we'd see a repeat of what happened in the U.S.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. That leads me to the next question. It's about the Supreme Court in Brazil and our institutions, our democratic institutions. So also, as you know, President Bolsonaro has been at war with the Supreme Court for a long time, right? So he has been pushing that war to the limit. He has gone the last Independence Day in Brazil, 7th of September, in front of thousands of people. He said he was not going to accept any more decisions by a specific judge. So my question is about the role of the Supreme Court in Brazil, the judiciary, and the dangers of that instability between the executive and the judiciary. The harmonious relationship between these branches of government, are they going to survive Bolsonaro? After Bolsonaro is gone, are you going to go back to the normal relations of it? Or do you see that there's going to be lingering effects of Bolsonaro after Bolsonarismo in Brazil?
Well, Brazil, the Supreme Court and the Brazilian judiciary in general, I think at times engage in what we call judicial overreach. And so that inevitably means that there will be some conflict with presidents. That's a normal part of democratic politics, right? What's unusual is the kind of frontal attacks that Bolsonaro engages in with respect to the Supreme Court. Now, President Trump did that a little bit with a few, I think they were federal judges, not Supreme Court judges, but there's a judge, I believe maybe even from Indiana with a Latino last name. I don't remember his name. But in the U.S., even that was kind of unusual. I don't think that there's a precedent, certainly since redemocratization in Brazil, of a president who was nearly as aggressive toward the Supreme Court as Bolsonaro has been. But does that mean, what are his chances of triumphing in this battle against the Supreme Court? I don't think they're that great. If Bolsonaro, it might be different if Bolsonaro had better public approval ratings, right? Latin American populist presidents who enjoy very high approval ratings have successfully attacked the court system. But that's not Bolsonaro's situation. His approval rating it's not abysmal. It's not like Dilma's or Temer's, but the last I saw it was around 30%. And so, he just doesn't have the kind of popularity that would enable him to successfully take on the court.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he does feel that, right? Because when he feels that he goes too far, then he always pulls back.
Yes.
Yes. So my next question is about, the part of the population in Brazil, and this is really baffling to me, it really mesmerizes me when I see protests in Brazil with people with the banner saying military intervention now. We want the military dictatorship back with Bolsonaro as president. So how can you explain that in 2022? We have been in a democracy since 1985. So that should have been a thing of the past. So how can you explain that?
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, the last generation of democracies, we see that even democracies that we thought were very stable, that were absolutely impregnable, have vulnerabilities. I think a really important part of an answer to your question is exactly the context that I described earlier. That is, deep economic crisis. I mean, Brazil, the Brazilian economy, Brazil on average is a poorer country today than it was a decade ago. It's another part of the context that we didn't talk about is very high crime rates. People are just sick of crime. And then these massive corruption scandals, which also tainted the Temer government and Bolsonaro's government, not only his government, but his whole family, right? There are serious corruption charges, credible corruption charges against him, his wife, and his sons. So in this context, and also, the alternative media, fake news, it's possible to mobilize pro-authoritarian messages. Now, I mean, we have to put this in context. The percentage of the Brazilian population that is actively calling for a return to military rule is tiny. I don't know what that percentage is. The percentage that supports Bolsonaro is much higher than that, but it too is a clear minority part.
Yeah, definitely. It's a subset, a small subset, but it's still shocking to see those
shocking.
Images
Yes.
on TV and the normalization of that. But maybe this is one of the things that we have to live in a democracy, right? You touched about something very important that I'd like to discuss with you, which is like the criminalization of politics in Brazil, or the politicization of crime. And I'm thinking specifically, you mentioned that there are rumors that Bolsonaro family is involved with militias in Rio. So can you tell us, our viewers, a little bit about that, about like what the militias are in Rio, and how they have penetrated in politics in the last decades?
Yes, well, the militias in Rio are these, they're private militias. Often most of the members are retired police officers or active police officers, and they function as protection rackets. So they often will attack organized crime. They also engage in killing of human rights activists. There was a famous human rights activist in Rio who was killed almost certainly by a militia.
Marielle Franco. Right?
Yes, exactly. So, I mean, in the city of Rio and the state of Rio, especially in poor neighborhoods, right? Either militias rule or organized criminal gangs rule. Not the whole territory, but huge swaths of the territory. So, a lot of Brazil is not governed by democracy. A lot of Brazil is governed by criminal gangs, usually they're called militias only in Rio, but the phenomenon exists way beyond Rio. If you go to the poor states in the Brazilian Northeast or the North, right, the Amazon region, you get the same phenomenon of these private militias that go around killing peasant leaders, labor leaders, human rights leaders. Now, Brazil at the national level is clearly a democracy, but then you get these big parts of Brazilian territory that are clearly not anything close to democracies.
Yeah, that is interesting. So when you talk about democracy in Brazil, you also have to see that reality of race, class, even geography, microgeography. Even if we're living in the same city like Rio, your level of citizenship and your right to exercise democratic rights, if you are living in a favela and if you live in the asfalto, where the middle class lives, is completely different.
Very different.
Right.
The effective exercise of rights in Brazil is very uneven. It's uneven by race, by class, by geography, exactly as you say. You know, if you are privileged enough to live in Leblon, which is a very wealthy part of Rio de Janeiro, it's a beautiful, beautiful neighborhood, stunning beaches. You know, the police there don't infringe on your rights, they protect your rights. But if you live in a favela in Rio, your effective exercise of rights is not what is written in the very progressive Brazilian Constitution.
That is very interesting. I have a question about, and we've been talking about all those dangers to Brazilian democracy today. Do you see any possibility of us having, and going back to the military intervention now, do you see any possibility like a node-style coup d'etat, or maybe the dangers to democracy today in Brazil and in the region are other?
Well, in Brazil, I think the possibility of a military coup is very, very low. First, because I don't think the military want to assume power. And second, you know, I think Brazil's political institutions have deficiencies for sure, but they also have some virtues. And I just don't think I don't think there's space for a military coup in Brazil. What does happen, what can happen is, the territory that's ruled by militias, by criminal organizations, or by by freely and fairly elected governors and mayors who are authoritarian, sometimes in collaboration with militias or with criminal organizations. This can expand, and it has expanded, no question about it. And I would say likewise, you know, with a president like Bolsonaro, my colleagues who are academics in Brazil feel that academic freedom has been under threat.
Good point.
Journalists now feel more under threat than they did 20 years ago in Brazil. So, you know, the fact that there's not going to be a military intervention doesn't mean that there aren't threats to democracy in Brazil. The threats are more quotidian. They're more the progressive degradation of rights than they are an outright military intervention.
Which is reversible, right? There's something
Yes.
very interesting about your book, Democracy and Dictatorships in Latin America. And as I was reading to prepare for this interview, I love when you and Professor Nebo say that in Latin America, political actors are very important, right? You can not only look at structures and cultures, but also political actors, right? You have this cult of a personality. All of this is reversible, right? We're living a Bolsonarismo now, but that can change, right? What are the prospects for Brazil?
Right. I mean, I think probably Lula will win the presidency in 2022. And, you know, Brazilian democracy deepened greatly between 1985 and 2010. So these are, you know, especially under Cardoso and Lula, Brazilian democracy deepened more than almost any other democracy in the world in that period. And I think that Lula's agenda is likely to be one, he will be very constrained in some ways because the PT, no party in Brazil is big, Brazil has the most fragmented party system in the world history of democracy. And what this means is that, you have to govern with very, very broad coalitions. In his first and second terms in office, Lula partly overcame this very, challenging circumstance through corruption. In 2005, there was the famous Mensalão scandal by which the PT national government was bribing mostly right-wing members of Congress to vote with it to gain support for its measures in Congress. But, I think Lula is not a perfect Democrat by any stretch of the imagination, but he's much, much, much more democratic than Bolsonaro. Bolsonaro, for someone who was freely and fairly elected, is almost a perfect authoritarian. Despite some ways in which I think Lula is not a perfect Democrat, I would say, my judgment is without question the PT governments, especially under his leadership, did a lot of very, very positive things for Brazil. They did some things that I think were abhorrent, in particular corruption scandals. But they helped to deepen democracy in Brazil in many ways. They reduced inequality. They were extremely effective at reducing poverty. Some of this was pretty easy to govern during the commodity boom. And maybe you could argue that Brazil should even have done better during Lula's terms than it did. But his 2 terms as a president were very effective in some really important ways, some ways that for Brazil, right, this was a country that was one of the most unequal in the world. It still is one of the most unequal. But to dramatically reduce poverty, to take some measures to create new opportunities for the black population in Brazil, to have reasonable economic growth. These were huge accomplishments for Brazilian democracy. One of the other ways in which, under his leadership, under Lula's leadership, the PT deepened democracy in Brazil was they shattered the monopoly of the authoritarian, personalistic clans that had governed many northeastern states for decades, and in some cases generations. So that too, you had the interior of the Northeast in Brazil is extremely poor. To have a measure of democratization and to give these very, very poor citizens effective citizenship, these were huge accomplishments. So what you say is absolutely correct. The erosion of democracy in Brazil in the last years can be reversed, and it really depends on the interplay between actors that want to deepen democracy and have the power to do it, and actors that want to roll back democracy and have the power to do it.
Yeah. So I love to end this interview on this optimist note. As a Brazilian, I'm very optimistic that we're going to strengthen again our democratic institutions. They're going to be able to fight poverty, and they're going to be able to fight corruption. Those are, big elements. Huge challenge for Brazil. Thank you very much, Professor Scott Mainwaring. Thank you for your analysis, for your insights. It was very insightful. And thank you for participating in this episode of Brazil Today.
Thank you so much for inviting me. My great pleasure.
Thanks.